Hello, Terry. Terry spun the flint of his big lighter, wafting its flame under a filthy spoon, caked with soot, and who knows what else. Beads of sweat rolled from his hairline into his eyes. However, the stinging sensation was nothing compared to the pain of his current state of withdrawal. Terry hadn't had a hit in 2 days, and the unsteadiness of his hands was evidence of this. As the contents of the spoon rippled with each tremor, it bubbled and reduced from the heat of the flame as the impurities escaped into the air. He'd already thrown up bile twice this morning, and hadn't had a proper night's rest in weeks. Yeah, cook for Daddy, he thought to himself with glee, his heart racing, both from withdrawal and anticipation of finally getting a fix. He placed a small piece of cotton in the spoon and tightened a rubber band around his wrist. He plunged the mixture up into his syringe, then placing it in his mouth, he held it between his teeth as he continued. He tightened the rubber band even more, opening and closing his fist a few times as his veins tightened. Taking the syringe from his mouth, he pierced the needle into one of the few veins that wasn't collapsed. He watched a red cloud of his blood blossom into the brown mixture within the clear plastic. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the plunger down slowly and exhaled. 7 seconds later, Terry eased himself back into the louse-ridden, antique Victorian chair. As his pupils reduced, a smirk of euphoria grew on his face. He began to nod off, but was startled alert by a low, growling rumble throughout this forgotten bungalow. Terry felt too good to be bothered with this, and figured it was just the house settling, or falling apart, he thought to himself. He let out a slight chuckle at his own wit, as ever-slowing blinks led him to unconsciousness. Terry has been a vagrant of Detroit's inner city for a few months now, just long enough to land a smack hookup and learn which of the abandoned houses weren't gang territory. He had never been in this house, though. Hell, he'd never been to this part of the city before. He was lost, figuratively and literally. Terry awoke, sweaty with drool on his chin, to what he could have sworn was the sensation of someone sucking the air from his lungs. The room was in a complete and total darkness, as if all the light had been vacuumed from the house. His eyes flicked back and forth, desperately, searching for a light source. Then he heard something that shot a streak of fear through him. The floor, the hardwood floor, that ran throughout the entirety of the home creaked. It creaked on both sides of him, as if something or someone was slowly closing in on him. He had checked each room in this house before he'd got comfortable. He always did this. Could he have overlooked someone? He covered his mouth with a shaking hand, eyes darting to his left and right, desperately trying to see something, anything. As the sound of shuffling, slow-moving feet started circling around him on the creaky floor, he realized he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. The steps were slow and deliberate, and where one ended, the other began, making it near impossible for him to track the sounds. He still couldn't see anything, despite his desperately searching eyes. The circling went on for a few more moments, and then, as suddenly as he was jarred from his sleep, the circling stopped. He sat dead still, terrified and trembling with his hand still covering his mouth, heart beating in his ears. Time seemed to be non-existent now, and Terry swore he could hear himself blink in the silent darkness. He sat unmoving and waited. Nothing. Terry reached into his pocket for his lighter. Pulling it out, he pressed his thumb down and rolled the flint. The first couple attempts failed, but on the third try he got it. His heart sang, but too soon, because in this instant, a light brighter than the sun blared through each window of the house. Feeling as if he had been blinded, he threw his hands to his face, flinging the lighter onto the floor, and balled himself up in the chair. Particles and dust swirled in the rays of the blazing light source. The muscles in Terry's eyes ached as the drastic change in lighting violently forced his pupils to pinpoints. It was as if the surface of the sun were mere meters from the house. After most of the pain in his head subsided, he moved a couple fingers aside and peeked out of his cupped hands. He looked around the room and found nothing. The same nothing that was there when he had entered the house. However, it wasn't until he smelled burning wood that he noticed something very bizarre. A set of barefoot prints occupied either side of the chair. The prints were facing forward, as if there were someone standing on each side of Terry. The strangest part about this is that the footprints were scorched into the wood. Terry's eyes started to adjust to the brightness of the room, and he began to notice other changes around him. When he looked at the windows, he noticed that nothing could be seen on the other side. It was as if he were surrounded by this light, in a universe consisting of nothing but the light. He stood from the chair and made his way to the bare pane of glass to the left of the front door. It appeared as if the windows were frosted, but with no objects on the other side, it was impossible to tell. Terry zipped up his jacket as his breath turned to vapor in the mildew-laden air. He laid his hand flat on the glass of the window, quickly recoiling. The glass was ice cold. He ran his index finger from the top of the window to the center, examining its smooth surface, his eyes glistening in the harsh white rays from the other side. "What the hell is this?" he asked himself out loud, shaking his head in confusion. He cupped his hands around his eyes and pressed them against the window. He could see nothing. Absolutely nothing. He continued peering into the bland universe that now surrounded him, his breath fogging the glass as he stood there like a child in wonderment. His breath stopped suddenly, though. He could see something. It was faint, but it was something. A silhouette. A dark, elliptical mass moving slowly toward him. The figure seemed to get a little closer each time he'd blink, and Terry strained his eyes as hard as he could and blinked desperately, trying to see what was approaching him. With a final blink, the shape was upon the window, eerily unmoving. Terry yelped and fell back on his ass, now staring up at the window. From this angle, he could now tell that the glass was opaque, as he could roughly make out the shape of the figure. The thing appeared to be a naked humanoid with gray flesh. It was very thin, with long, wispy black hair and deep, dark sockets for eyes. Although Terry knew it'd be impossible for anything to see inside the house from outside, he felt a hole being stared through him as the thing stood there. It was unmoving, like a thin gray abomination of a mannequin. The thing raised and pressed flat on the glass, two long fingered hands, as if to brace itself. It then moved its head close to the glass, not taking its eyes off of Terry. The thing cocked its head to the side and began slowly, almost intimately, licking the glass with a dark red tongue. Each lick left a trail of thick red goop that stretched and slapped against the creature's face as it continued. The slurping and gulping could be heard inside of the house, like someone stirring wet noodles. Terry cringed and coughed up puke into his mouth, which he spat onto the floor. The creature stopped at this and giggled, as if it could clearly see into the room, and was amused. It continued licking the glass, faster now, and began moaning erotically. Removing one hand from the glass, it began caressing its long, spindly body and gyrating. Terry watched in disgust and horror, unable to pry his eyes away from the grotesque display taking place in front of him. "What do you want?" Terry yelled as tears filled his eyes. "Stop it! Where am I and what do you want?" The thing abruptly stopped the licking in its display of self-pleasure, almost disappointedly, and stepped back from the glass. It raised a long finger to the red mass of slobber and started writing something. Terry watched in horror and intrigue as its crooked gray finger scribed through the mess T-E-R-R-Y. His heart sank and he felt the nausea return. Terry, still sitting on the floor where he had landed when he fell, began to feel the house vibrating. He felt the same rumbling feeling that he felt after he had shot up. He looked all around the room, as if searching for the source, and then back to the window. The thing was gone, but his name remained, dripping down the smooth surface of the glass, as if each letter were melting. The whole house was now clattering. The beer bottles that were strewn across the floor were clinking, and the windows began to rattle as the rumbling became more violent. If you've ever ridden in an airplane, you'll know the feeling you get when the plane decelerates rapidly in midair. 1 minute everything is fine, your ears are popping as you enjoy the view from 25,000 feet, and then BAM! The plane slows abruptly to what feels like a dead stop, and you feel as if every millimeter of blood in your body was seized in mid-flow. You have the sensation of falling although you're seated, and for a moment it feels and sounds as if the turbines have just fallen from the wings. You sit there in silence, puzzled and frightened, awaiting the unknown. This is the feeling Terry felt before he was lifted from the floor and sent spinning upward, slamming back first into the ceiling of the room. He felt the house plummet, heard the sound of wind whooshing outside, and pieces of the old vinyl siding snapping off in the turbulence. The light from outside strobed, as if he were falling through a lit underground tunnel. Terry felt himself falling even faster, and he started to see stars. Drool streamed from the sides of his mouth onto his cheeks and into his ears. His vision tunneled and his world went black. The room was sweltering, so hot that fumes from the intensity of the heat were visible. This was unlike the heat from a hot summer day. It was more like the heat from an oven or stovetop, dry and intense. The kind of heat that seemingly burns all oxygen from the air. simulating the feeling of suffocation. Red and orange danced on every surface. The sound of burning wood crackling was audible and could be smelled in high concentrations. Terry's nostrils flared as a trail of black smoke curled in his nasal cavity. His lungs filled, and he coughed as his body expelled the toxin. One of his eyes peeled open, slowly and rigidly. His eyelids adhered together by a combination of his bodily fluids, most likely snot and drool. He raised his hand and rubbed his open eye, soothing it. Then he moved his hand to the other eye, inhaling sharply in pain as he forcefully pried it open. He lay face down in the room, unmoving, and examined his surroundings. The antique chair was broken into pieces and strewn about. The floor was littered with amber glass shards from the beer bottles, along with miscellaneous debris. He took a deep breath and a few moments to collect himself before he tried to stand. He placed his hands flat on the floor and pushed himself up to one knee, facing the door. The door was partway open, and through it he could see his new surroundings. Terry stood slowly to his feet, unable to remove his eyes from the area outside of the door. He was in complete and utter disbelief of what lay in front of him. After several minutes of staring mutely out the now badly charred door and experiencing a cacophony of emotions, he slowly walked forward toward the opening. He placed his hand on the door and slowly pushed it the rest of the way open. Liquid magma and stone surrounded him. Stifling heat desiccated the sensitive membranes of his eyes, and an absolutely foul odor assaulted his nostrils. The area looked like a cave system, with a lake of white hot lava running underneath various natural bridges of stone. It looked like something from a fantasy movie, and it smelled like a long-forgotten septic tank, full of rotting flesh. The house sat in a wide, flat plain of stone, the rear facing a wall that was at least 50 feet high, which connected to a stalactite-covered ceiling. The front and sides of the house were exposed to a series of caverns in open space. Terry could see shadows dancing on the walls of the entrance to one of the caverns. He also heard voices, faintly echoing from the direction of the same entrance. He turned his ear and craned his neck in the direction of the talking, in an effort to hear what was going on. He could hear a deep voice, speaking a language unknown to him. Then he heard a female scream, "No! Get away from me! Stop it! Somebody help!" Terry was a piece of shit, but he wasn't a coward, and besides, he had to try and find a way out of here. He grabbed the neck of a busted beer bottle off of the floor and walked cautiously out the door, his makeshift weapon at the ready. He crept his way onto the natural rock bridge that led to the cavern where he could still hear the screaming. Terry turned around to check his distance from the house. If he needed to retreat, that shit stack would still be his best option. His eyes widened, and he mouthed the words, "Are you fucking serious?" as his eyes reflected the emptiness before him. There was nothing left. No indentation where it had once sat. No remnants of debris from it. Nothing. This was mild in comparison to what Terry had witnessed since entering that house. He figured there wasn't much he could do about it now. So he turned to face the cavern and continued on. He crept carefully, avoiding the liquid death trap beneath him until he found himself at the entrance of the cavern. Crouching to one side of the opening, with the bottle still held tight in his hand, He listened. He could still hear the shrieks of what sounded like a young woman and the grunts of a man that sounded gigantic in stature. He peeked an eye around the entrance and examined the area, finding it empty. He could still hear the sounds, but there was no one there. Besides a couple of torches mounted on the walls, the cavern was barren. Terry's face wrinkled in confusion as he stood there, dumbfounded. He gripped the bottleneck in his fist, checked his surroundings, and slowly walked into the cavern. The room was no bigger than 15 by 15 and was nearly a perfect square. He walked towards the sound, and cold chills overtook his entire body when he found the source. He crouched and picked up the tape recorder, and with a loud click, pressed the stop button. Terry held the tape deck in both hands and stared at it, contemplating just what the fuck was happening to him. A skittering sound jarred him out of his daydream-like state. He jumped, dropped the tape deck and spun around, just missing whatever made that sound. He thought he saw a human foot through the entrance to the cavern, as if someone were running by. He clenched the neck of the broken bottle, put his back to the wall, and inched his way towards the entrance. The skittering echoed throughout the massive cave. Sweat ran down Terry's face as he peeked around the corner of the entrance. He felt a cold hand smack him in the face, the nails of the hand taking stringy pieces of flesh with them and leaving wide gashes behind. Terry dropped the bottle, and it fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. He raised his hands to the pain in his face. Blood dripped in thick violet streams from between his fingers as he let out an animalistic roar. Before he could process what was happening, his attacker was upon him again. As he was tackled to the ground, Terry saw it. He saw the thing from the window, and his guts turned to ice. The creature had him straddled, face up, in an instant, and wasted no time mauling Terry with its long bony fingers and razor-sharp black nails. It slapped him and backhanded him across the face viciously and repeatedly. Blow after blow, more blood spilled from Terry's mouth and the deep gashes he had previously received. Terry was defenseless, as this thing was infinitely stronger than him, despite his spindly build. Any time Terry would raise his hands in retaliation, the thing would knock them away with ease, and cackle in his face, and continue the beating. The creature's blows soon slowed as it was tiring. It landed one more victorious smack across Terry's mouth, bringing a couple of teeth with it this time. Terry turned his head and spat an absolute mess of blood out of his swollen face. He turned his head facing forward, looking right at the thing, and spit another big mouthful of blood into its face. It threw its head back and cackled, then raised its hands in the air, clasping them together. It then began hammer-punching Terry in the chest, directly above his heart. With his eyes nearly swollen shut, blood dripping from his face and ears, Terry fought desperately to hold on to consciousness. The blows to his chest tempted his heart to stop beating and brought stars to his eyes. And Terry thought about the few good times in his life as the world around him faded to black. Clear? Terry felt another blow, hot and deep in his chest this time. We got something here, people. Get an IV in him stat. The heart rate monitor began beeping, and Terry could hear the wail of a siren winding up, and the engine of the ambulance revved. You're going to be all right, buddy. Just hang on. We're almost to the hospital, said the EMS nurse as he placed an oxygen mask over Terry's mouth and pressed some buttons on a box connected to him. Jesus, that's the 6th overdose today, said another EMS worker from the front of the ambulance with a pained look on his face. Terry took deep breaths and fell into a sleep. He awoke in a hospital bed to the sound of rain pattering on a window. He slowly opened his eyes to a dimly lit hospital room. A dimly lit room that he could see clearly. He brought his hands to his face and felt his eyes. There was no swelling anywhere. He moved his tongue around in his mouth, and all of his teeth were there. He rejoiced and nearly shed a tear in his elation. He felt well enough to stand, and man did he ever have to piss. And Terry sat up slowly and turned in the bed, placing his feet on the cold tile floor. The bathroom wasn't hard to locate, as it was the only door in the room besides the exit. He stood and shuffled into the bathroom, shutting the door behind himself. Terry did his business and stepped to the sink to wash his hands. He felt like shit ran over twice. So when he was done washing his hands, he decided to rinse his face with some cold water. He turned the squeaky knob of the faucet and looked at himself in the mirror. Terry felt his bowels loosen when he saw the reflection of the door behind him. Written in the same mess of thick red liquid from the house was, "Hello, Terry." The metal rings of the shower curtain scraped across the rod. Terry grimaced, and a tear ran down his face.